Hello and welcome to the Mormon Yeshiva. This new series is entitled The Hidden Revelation in the Book of Mormon, subtitled Approaching the Great and Marvelous Work. Again, please make note of our fair use disclaimer. This is just for educational purposes. When we talk about the Book of Mormon, we're talking about sacred literature, Israelite sacred literature to be specific. So, for example, how do we know this is the case? Notice what it says in 2 Nephi. For I, Nephi, was constrained to speak unto them, according to his word, for I had spoken many things unto them, and also my father, before his death, many of which sayings are written upon mine other plates, for a more history part are written upon mine other plates. And notice what he says here in verse 15. And upon these I write the things of my soul, and many of the scriptures which are engraven upon the plates of brass. For my soul delighteth in the scriptures, and my heart pondereth them, and writeth them for the learning and profit of my children. So these concepts, when you see this phraseology, the things of my soul, the idea of engraven upon plates of brass, this gives us a marker, a prophetic marker into the understanding that the Book of Mormon itself, what type of record it is. And it falls under the category, of course, sacred Israelite literature. So what does that mean? Well, of course, the things of my soul. Soul comes from the Hebrew word neshama, or the spirit that leaves our bodies when we die. Now, there is also another word that is often translated as the word soul. It's nephesh. But that particular word means something more like the actual living being of your body, the part, the animalistic part, the lower part. But the neshama, that is the part that ascends back and forth to heaven. The word engravings is a symbolic marker for the idea of meditations or revelation, really. The idea of things being, as he meditates upon these ancient things, these are the revelations that are given to his soul that he is recording. And of course, plates of brass. Now, interesting, brass, when you see metals in the scriptures, brass, in this case, brass is something that is associated with the angelic, like a certain, and by angelic, it is a certain group or level of angelic beings. Whereas silver and gold would also have meanings of higher levels, gold being like what we would consider like celestial, and silver being what probably would, the word, the word that we call in Hebrew, Bariah, or those things which are more of a higher level of angelic. So it's a little bit different, but the idea of brass, of course, is associated with the angelic. So these little markers here give us an idea of what type of literature that we're reading. So this is not strictly a historical text. It is a multidimensional text. So if you'll notice, sacred literature in ancient Israel is not meant to be taken only at face value. In other words, when you read the stories of Adam and Eve, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, King David, those kind of things, they are not meant only to be read at face value. That face value is what we call the Peshat level, or the literal story, the actual narrative itself. It is, in many ways, a child story, or at least a story that is narrated in a historical event, but meant to convey at the same time something else. So it is also referred to, this level of the story, this outer storyline. It was also referred to as the veil of unbelief, or the veil that is put there for the unbelieving, or those who are not seeking to fulfill God's commandments. It is just the plain literal story. It doesn't mean that it's bad. It doesn't mean that it's less than per se. It just means that if you were to take this story and read it to a child, they would always remember it. I mean, if we think back in time when our parents read to us different scriptures, whether it be like the stories of Joseph in Egypt or uh, Jacob and Rachel and Leah, Adam and Eve, Cain killing Abel, Noah's and his ark. I mean, those are the stories that they're meant to be communicated so that we will always remember the stories. Now, the devil is actually in the details here. However, we need to understand that, you know, in sacred literature, the Peshat level it appears at surface level very plain and simplistic in some ways, just straightforward. You know, Nephi builds a ship. Nephi literally builds a ship. Nephi slays Laban. Nephi literally slays Laban. But the way the story is written, the way it is crafted, the way it is told, different words that appear, different names that appear, different numbers that appear, are written in such a way to contain a greater revelation. And these greater revelations are encased or encoded into the text so that as we grow and mature, we begin to see this prophetic piece of art from many different dimensions. We know in ancient Israel that we know at least there are four dimensions, and which are outlined here: Peshat, which is the literal; Remez, which is more of your allegorical or symbolic meaning; Drash, which means a comparative meaning as compared to similar occurrences, accounts, or teachings from others uh, in others; and then of course the Sod. This is the secret, esoteric, or mystical meanings of the text. Now, remember, this is not all. Some of the ancient traditions say that some of the scriptures have meanings up to 10 dimensions, depending on what level of ascent and relationship with God a person may have. But it's not to get overwhelmed, but the important thing to understand is that you are dealing with a multidimensional text. So while we always want to stay grounded in the literal text, okay, that's the story, that's our foundation. Remember that built into that foundation is also many ancient things meant to communicate history, astronomy, mathematics, you name it. So the language of Israel is the language of cycles. In fact, they're often called them prophetic cycles. In these prophetic cycles, we these cycles commence and are represented often by what we call the alphabet. If you'll notice here on the screen, just like in a sense our galaxy spirals and rotates in cycles, so too does the Hebrew alphabet. The cycle commences with the letter Aleph and ends with the letter Tav, only to begin again. So the Aleph Tav is also the Alpha and the Omega, or as the Messiah says, I am the beginning and the end. So it's the idea that everything that has a beginning has an end, which then leads to a new beginning, which is actually a very important sign to all believers. And we'll discuss that on a later part of this series regarding Samuel the Lamanite and the sign given at the time of the Messiah's birth. These symbolic teachings and signs, these cycles contain teachings of the astronomy and the cosmos. They also contain teachings regarding prophetic numbers. So in other words, there is an actual ancient science of prophetic numbers. So in the Book of Mormon, just like the Bible, numbers often mean things and carry with them, as well as the pattern of the numbers, ancient understanding. So never just read over the numbers. The numbers themselves also contain hidden meanings. But what I want to focus on today is the importance of the Book of Mormon. More than anything, we need to understand what the Book of Mormon really is. And we find this given in 3 Nephi 26. Now, the traditional understanding of this, or Gentile understanding of this particular section, is one thing, but the Israelite understanding is something else. So let's take a look at 3 Nephi 26, verse 6. And it shall come to pass that the Lord shall bring forth unto you the words of a book, and they shall be the words of them which have slumbered. And behold, the book shall be sealed, and in the book shall be a revelation from God, from the beginning of the world to the ending thereof. Now let's take a look at that. So the Book of Mormon is the book of those which have slumbered, and in it contains a record, okay, it contains a revelation from God from the beginning of the world to the ending thereof, a complete cycle. Now, we in the traditional viewpoint think, oh, that must be something that is, waiting to be translated again when the portion of the Book of Mormon that was not translated is restored. Well, there may be a truth to that. There's obviously going to be additional information. But from an Israelite understanding, the idea of a sealed book is something quite different. And notice what it says in regard to a sealed book. In verse 8, wherefore, because of the things which are sealed up, the things which are sealed up shall not be delivered in the days of the wickedness and abominations of the people. Wherefore, the book shall be kept from them. But the book shall be delivered unto a man, and he shall deliver the words of the book, which are the words of those who have slumbered in the dust. And he shall deliver these words unto another. So while the traditional view is that we still have further records to come forth, and I do believe there are further records that will come forth, the ancient understanding of a sealed book is sealed not because it hasn't been translated yet necessarily, and is or under lock and key, but it's sealed in the ancient sense is that it is kept from our understanding. In other words, the entire Book of Mormon is a sealed book because there is something in it that is being kept from our understanding until the time is right. Now again, I don't want you to think I don't believe that there are further records to be translated and come forth. Obviously that there are. But from a traditional Israelite point of view, if I were to talk about a sealed book, it is the idea is that I may have the record, but the full meaning of the record is not being shown or not being understood. Therefore, the book remains sealed. In other words, you just don't understand what you've received. But notice what it says about this revelation from the beginning to the end. It says, but the words which are sealed he shall not deliver, neither shall he deliver the book. For the book shall be sealed by the power of God, and the revelation which was sealed shall be kept in the book until the own due time of the Lord, that they may come forth. For behold, they reveal all things from the foundation of the world unto the end thereof. So the foundation of the world is, of course, its creation. And we think of the idea of world as in just the earth. But there's another meaning. In fact, the ancient Israelite meaning has more than the idea of just a creation of this particular planetary body. The idea of a world is the idea of a cycle that has existed on this earth. So in other words, if we were to take from Adam down to the book of Revelation as a cycle of mankind, what happened before Adam? Well, in ancient Israelite thought, there was another cycle. And in that cycle, they had an establishment, their rise and fall. They had a Messiah, and there was already a resurrection from the dead. In fact, even some traditions, this ancient Messiah from the last cycle, his name was passed down as Meheshi. Now, whether that's true or not, we do not know for sure. But the idea is there that there were cycles or civilizations or worlds that existed on this earth prior to what we would often consider as Adam or the age of man. So why is the Book of Mormon so important? Well, in addition to being another testimony of Jesus Christ, the Book of Mormon contains an actual revelation from the beginning to the end of the world. Now, again, we think of this record very similar to the way we think of the Bible, in the sense of there's Genesis to Revelation, so you have a beginning to the end of the world, a cycle. Well, the Book of Mormon also contains a cycle, but it is written in the patterns and symbols of the text. In other words, the Book of Mormon contains a much more ancient account and preserves it through the language of cycles, symbols, and patterns. In other words, we often commence our understanding of things with the Genesis creation, and that is true. But there's also more to the understanding of Hebraic thought. And if we understand the cycles of creation, then those things of the prophetic past make sense, as well as those things that we are going through currently, as well as what we'll continue to go through in the future. In other words, cycles repeat. Names and places changes, but the story is still the same. So the Book of Mormon represents a complete cycle that actually commences, and this is demonstrated in the Book of Mormon, where we're given the years that the Book of Mormon commences with Lehi's leaving Jerusalem 600 years before Christ, and finishes, or the last date mentioned in the Book of Mormon, at 420 years after Christ. If I put my Israelite hat on, when we go back to the numerical science of ancient Israel, 600 distills to the numerical value of 6, which is the Hebrew letter Vav. 420, 420, 4 plus 2 plus 0, also distills to the numerical value of 6, or the letter Vav. So a complete cycle around the wheel of the letters. In other words, Vav it commences in the letter Vav and it ends on a letter Vav, only to restart again. But the idea being is it represents a complete cycle from Vav to Vav. In a sense, the letter Vav also represents the idea of an umbilical cord to heaven. Is connected to the concept of the Messiah. But this idea is that the record indicates a cycle from the letter Vav through the alphabet back to the letter Vav, a complete cycle. And so if we were to look at this from a creative experience or a creative comparison, we would probably say, okay, so Genesis to Revelation would represent a cycle, creation of man all the way to the end of the world. Okay. However, even in Christianity, they have the idea of a millennium. So a new cycle starting, something starting. Okay. Same thing here, except from a Hebraic mind, we use the alphabet. So in here, the cycle commences on a Vav and it ends on a Vav. It gives us an idea. The letter Vav and its meaning gives us an idea also to the purpose of the book itself. So what is this revelation? Well, it's knowledge and history more ancient than Israel. It contains those things which occurred not only at the time of Adam and of course the patriarchs after, but also what occurred before in a prior cycle, in a prior world. So the revelation is a revelation of a cycle or prior cycle or world that also reveals itself in this cycle or world. In other words, there was one complete cycle and it was destroyed, and then tohu and vohu, it was, basically made desolate and then had to be replenished again. Same thing with this, even if you look at the Nephites. They went through a complete cycle in the literal text. They were utterly destroyed. And then, of course, their society was destroyed. And then what did God do? God brought forth the Gentiles as part of another cycle. Now, these are smaller cycles we're referring to here. But what we're talking about in the overall paradigm of the Book of Mormon is that it is also representing a great cycle, a greater creative or Genesis event, if you will, of this world. So if you'll notice in this particular slide, we see that there's the timeline or the Peshat or literal story of the Book of Mormon. We see here that it commences, we see, of course, the Jaredites coming. We see the Nephites coming over, and then, of course, them splitting up between the Nephites and the Lamanites. And then, of course, you have the people of Mulek, being absorbed somewhere in there. And then, of course, you have from the people of the time of King Benjamin onto the time of Christ. And then, of course, somewhere around 400 AD, them finally, being utterly destroyed. So that's the linear timeline. Now, on a cyclical timeline, it contains a revelation of something much older. So in this greater timeline or cycle or pattern that we want to identify that the Book of Mormon contains, we also need to understand we need to set aside a little bit of our common traditions. In other words, we've been given the literal story of, say, Adam and Eve, and we think Adam and Eve have Cain and Abel, and that is the literal Peshat level of the story. At the same time, those names are representatives of cycles and peoples. Now, however long ago they were, we do not know, but we know that it is actually greater than 7,000 years. In fact, it could be many hundreds of thousands of years, perhaps even more. We are not sure. But we do know there were many cycles. So, for example, while we would interpret a traditional story of, you know, Adam and Eve being cast out of the garden, they have Cain and Abel, Cain kills Abel. Another way of reading the story is the civilization of Adam fell from an Edenic state, if you will. And out of them came two other civilizations, represented one by uh, Abel and the other by Cain. Cain kills Abel. The civilization or peoples of Cain wipe out the people of Abel. And then another civilization rises in its place, Seth. Now the length of times of these civilizations we can only speculate. Maybe hundreds of years, they may be hundreds of thousands of years. We do not know, but we know that the cycles predate um, much of what predate Moses and much of these things. But the idea is that there were earlier cycles, what in some cases we would call those civilizations that existed before Adam. Okay, so what does the Book of Mormon teach us about this pattern? Well, let's take a look first off at the peoples involved in the Book of Mormon. You have the people of Lehi, who then break up into two sets of peoples called the Nephites and the Lamanites. You have the people of Jared, who are actually a much older people, and we have a small account of their rise and fall, their cycle, if you will. And then, of course, you have the people of Mulek, who probably combined with that should have been some of the people of the Jaredites, and they were probably intermingled among some of those areas, which is where we get the idea of Zarahemla and the later Coriantumers, who are probably descendants of some of those people, these large and mighty men. And all of these groups came to the land of promise. So if we were to look at the pattern of the Book of Mormon from a larger perspective, instead of just seeing the literal story, which is important, as Lehi leaving Jerusalem and coming to the land of promise, we need to understand that on a larger scale, on a multidimensional scale, the land of promise is also a symbol for this earth, meaning the actual planet that we live on. So the Jaredites, the Lehites, both Nephites and Lamanites, and the people of Mulek represent three groups that were brought to this earth. With the Jaredites and specifically Coriantumr, who was left over at the end there, being from a previous cycle prior to the symbolic Nephites and Lamanites. In other words, while in the literal story we're reading a story about Lehi, Nephi, and the Nephites and the Lamanites and the Jaredites, these groups of people are symbols also for people from a prior cycle who were brought here to people this earth. Now that sounds strange to some, science fiction to others, but it's the idea that there have been many worlds that have existed. And so in the record of the Book of Mormon, not only are we getting a record of the Nephites here on this continent, we're being given a pattern of what occurred in the prior world before what we would think of as, say, our Eden. Now that sounds strange and maybe far-fetched to some, but I would ask that you consider it. So these cycles of righteousness that were experienced by these various groups, such as the rise and fall of the Jaredites or the rise and fall of the Nephites, in their symbol form, not the literal form, but in the pattern, also represent what happened to the groups of people that previously peopled this earth. So in other words, the first cycle actually presented was symbolized by the people of Jared. They're coming down from the Great Tower, which is an ancient symbol for an ancient civilization. They came from an ancient civilization that collapsed. Their establishment, their blessing, their decay, and their utter destruction. So just like the literal Jaredites who were, landed here in America, set up a civilization here, the pattern of the story also represents a much earlier world or creation or previous cycle of a people who were brought here, they peopled the earth, and they had their rise, their fall, and utter destruction, at which time the second cycle began, which was symbolized by Lehi. So if you think about it, the second cycle presented was symbolized by Lehi, and then of course those people, that group of people representing the family of Lehi, breaking into two distinct groups, the Lamanites and the Nephites, their journey, their establishment, their blessing and decay, their utter destruction on this earth, with the Mulekites representing people found here and then later combining with the Nephites. In other words, in the micro pattern or microcycle of this particular account of the Nephites, which is about them, their rise and fall, it also contains another story of a prior cycle where these people came from and their rise and fall. So it gives us an idea of what has gone on before, what is occurring now, and what will probably happen again. So in these cycles repeat. And the importance of this is if we learn from the cycles, we can begin to adjust accordingly and change course if necessary. So the greater revelation hidden in the Peshat or literal story, in other words, the writers of the Book of Mormon are revealing a greater history of this earth with its varying peoples, their rise and fall, including their ultimate destructions. So in a sense, if we were to look at this perhaps from a linear timeline a little more, if we were to look at, we go back as far as, say, Adam and Eve in our literal story. But if the world was replenished, then there was another world that existed prior to that. Now, by world, I don't mean another Earth necessarily, but basically another cycle or civilization that existed on this planet. And if that is the case, what we're getting here is not only the literal stories of Nephi and Lehi and the Jaredites and Mulekites, but also in its pattern, we're being given an account of a much earlier cycle and what happened to them. This is why you see the similar patterns in the journeys between the Jaredites and the Nephites, or excuse me, the people of Lehi, to the Promised Land. As you study the Book of Mormon, you'll pay close attention to the similarity of patterns. Patterns mean things, especially patterns that repeat. There's something there for us to understand. So let's take a look at a specific pattern here that actually contains a much more ancient teaching. Okay, this is in 1 Nephi 2, and this is where Lehi leaves Jerusalem. And it says, and it came to pass that he departed into the wilderness, in verse 4, and he left his house and the land of his inheritance, and his gold and his silver and his precious things, and took nothing with him, save it were his family and provisions and tents, and departed into the wilderness. Then notice what it says. And he came down by the borders near the shore of the Red Sea. And he traveled in the wilderness in the borders which were near the Red Sea. And he did travel in the wilderness with his family, which consisted of my mother, Saria, and my elder brothers, who were Laman, Lemuel, and Shem. And it came to pass that when he had traveled 3 days into the wilderness, 3 days is a special number, he pitched his tent in a valley by the side of a river of water. Now, that valley by the side of the river of water, pay close attention to. So again, we one of the things we want to take a look at is the idea of the valley by the side of the river of water. Now, what's interesting is, in addition to being a literal description, the way this particular chapter is crafted is also crafted to contain both more ancient symbols as well as astronomical symbols. So this is why you see the similar patterns in the journeys between the two. Now let's take a look at the Jaredites real quick, and let's see what they did. And notice again some of the patterns. And it came to pass that Jared and his brother and their families, and also the friends of Jared and his brother and their families, where did they go? They went down into the valley, which in this case, in this part of the account, which was northward. Very important. Northward is a very important ancient symbol in the ancient world, especially ancient Israel. We think of not just directional north, but we also need to think of celestial north in the sense of looking up to the stars. And the name of the valley was Nimrod. Very important. Being called after the mighty hunter. With their flocks, which they had gathered together, male and female of every kind. And notice what it says, which is very interesting words here. And they did also lay snares and catch fowls in the air. And they did also prepare a vessel in which they did carry with them the fish of the waters. Now, wait a minute. If you're going to the promised land, why would you need a vessel to carry fish of the waters if you're already sailing there? Makes no sense, unless this is describing something else. And of course it goes on, they did carry with them Deseret, which by interpretation is a honeybee, symbol for ancient teachings, those things of the ancient world. And they did carry with them swarms of bees, and all manner of things which were upon the face of the land, seeds of every kind. And as it says, and it came to pass that when they came down into the valley of Nimrod, or the valley of the mighty hunter, the Lord came down and talked with the brother of Jared, and he was in a cloud, and the brother of Jared saw him not. Now those are some interesting symbols there. They are both literal in their telling of the literal story, but they're also highly symbolic in the way they're written, because they're communicating to us something else, something quite celestial in nature. So again, let's take a look at these patterns. People of Lehi and his family leave Jerusalem and go down into the wilderness. The people of Jared leaves the great tower. Now, Jerusalem, while being a city, people need to understand, is also a pattern for the heavens above, with the temple itself at its heart being a symbol for, the galaxy, as well as it serves as a symbol. The organization outline of the temple serves as a pattern for here on Earth, for our solar system, our galactic center. All depends upon perspective. Whereas, and the brother of Jared, they leave their great tower in ancient society. The tower is also carries with it the idea of some other symbols in ancient Israel, like a flying lamed, or the destruction of their civilization. They travel to a valley by a stream. Okay, Lehi's people travel to a valley by a stream. The people of Jared are scattered, travel to a valley of Nimrod next to the sea. People of Lehi, they wander in the wilderness, and then they are brought to the land bountiful, which they build a vessel by the great waters. The people of Jared build barges to sail the great waters. The people of Lehi, they then sail to the promised land, or the land of promise. The people of Jared, they then sail to the land of promise. The people of Lehi, they reach the land of promise. The people of Jared, they arrive at the land of promise. Now, this pattern is important because he's actually telling us in this pattern a much older story. Now, while they literally went one direction, they also, in other words, they literally, left Jerusalem. They traveled in the wilderness. They built a vessel and came here. Okay. The symbolic story being told is that you have groups of people who left somewhere in the heavens. Jerusalem being a symbol of the heavens, the Great Tower also being a symbol of something in the heavens. They came here, they went to a valley. What is that valley? This is where we come to the understanding of the character Nephi. Now, there is an actual connection between Nephi, the word Nephi, Nimrod, and the mighty hunter, and the constellation Orion. Most ancient literature has an Orion figure. The Book of Mormon is no different. We often read over these things very quickly, never knowing that at the same time while we're reading a literal account of someone, we're also reading a story of celestial events, astronomical teachings, and also things that they recorded using these symbols in the heavens to tell us a more ancient story. So what are some of these connections and why is it so important? Well, this is where we need to begin to understand the connection between Nephi and the constellation Orion. So the Nephi and the Orion connection. So first off, we should note the name Nephi itself, NEPHI. Okay, and notice the name of the word for giants in the book of Genesis 6:4, Nephil. Okay, the giants, Nephil, Nephi, share the same basic parent letters, which shows there's a relationship that you are meant to draw. These giants, were often referred to as when the sons of God took the daughters of men, and they were like mighty men of old, men of renown, is how it's said. But in reality, it's in Hebrew, it's men of the name. Okay, and Nimrod, okay, obviously was being, his name is connected to the idea he was a mighty hunter. Well, the concept of the mighty hunter comes from Egypt, which is the idea of Osiris. Osiris was the mighty hunter. Osiris is Orion, and Orion is the mighty hunter. He's also, the constellation of Orion is also called the giant. So in our record of Nephi, we're also being given a teaching of Nephi and the constellation Orion, which is demonstrating something as a picture in the heavens that we're supposed to understand. But when over the generations and through many of our, the apostasies, rises and falls, we've lost a lot of this knowledge. So in this case, the Nephi and his journeyings is also a picture of the constellation Orion as it goes through the heavens. So how do we know this? Well, first off, we should be looking at not only by the name Nephi and how it connects us to Nephil, the giant, also the mighty hunter, as well as, Osiris in heaven, Osiris, the god of Egypt, names that are all associated, but are all basically an Orion figure. So in this case, let's take a look at the story of Nephi and Laban, or Lavan. Now, what's interesting is that the imagery that we get is Nephi, comes outside the walls of Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is a symbol for the heavens. Nephi, the constellation Orion, passes beyond the wall. So he comes up in ascent. And then notice this is that he cuts off Laban's head. He finds him in the streets of Jerusalem. Well, this is strange to us because literal account, we actually read these things. The symbolic account is that first off, Laban or Lavan, whose name means like a celestial whiteness, is also another term or name, if you will, for the moon, which in ancient Israel held the keys to the heaven and earth. Which, if you'll think about it, Laban held the plates which contain the record of the Jews, and they were stored in the treasury in Jerusalem, okay, in the temple, and Zoram had the keys, those keys to the temple, to the treasury. So you'll see these related symbols. So the idea of Nephi not only cutting off Laban's head gives you a celestial symbol between the constellation Orion and the moon itself, symbolized by Laban. It also serves as another symbol. It's the idea of the soul, your nephesh, okay, your neshama, and coming into contact with a mighty one, and then ascending. So this is how you can tell it's a very much divine, very hyper intelligent being wrote this book, is because the fact that the symbols serve as they can serve as multi-dimensional level to teach different things. So they can teach you an astronomical principle, and they can also teach you things regarding the sod level, meaning of the ascent of the soul back into heaven. Then they also teach you a literal story of Nephi slaying Laban and the idea of law and among the Israelites. On a multidimensional factor and analysis, these things begin to show a much greater picture. There's also the epic of Nephi's bow. Now, in many of the ancient stories, Nephi not only had, we see him at some say it's Nephi's shield, but in other accounts it was, Orion's shield. There was also had Orion's bow. What's interesting is he goes up to a mountain and he meets the Lord there, and he tells him, where shall I go to find food, kind of thing, because he broke his bow. Well, it's a teaching regarding in ancient Israel what is called the bow of hope. Orion's bow, as you'll notice in the picture up there to the far left with his bow up there, points toward, as you'll see right here, where it's the shield there in that picture, and just below it, it points toward the constellation Taurus. So Orion's bow is pointing us to the constellation Taurus, i.e. the bull, which is called the mountain of the Lord's house. Constellations and mountains, okay, being interchangeable symbols. So the mountain of the Lord's house, we think in the last days, the Lord, the Lord's house will be established among the tops of the mountains. We can think of that literally, and we can also think of it symbolically in the sense of the mountain or constellation of the Lord's house, in this case, Taurus, is in the tops of the constellation. So it's exalted above all the other constellations. And that actually did occur during the age of Taurus. So these are also astronomical teachings attempting to restore to us much more ancient knowledge than just what we think. So Nephi and his bow and that whole epic, not only does it contain a very ancient teaching that we call the bow of hope, which is how a person uh, walks the center path back from this world into the presence of God, but it also contains an astronomical teaching and demonstrated in the heavens of the constellation Taurus, of Orion pointing his bow, shooting his arrow, to the constellation Taurus. And, of course, Nephi went forth and he, took his bow and slayed, wild beasts. Notice it said wild beasts, and for food. So these are symbolic stories as well. So in the actual account is couched and not only an astronomical teaching, but a much more ancient teaching. We also need to understand Nephi's Odyssey. Now, this is the interesting thing. Orion symbols abound in the ancient world. So in the Book of Mormon, we shouldn't be shocked to find that Nephi and the constellation Orion have, same background. So in other words, they have the same, they follow that same pattern. So for example, Nephi's Odyssey, Nephi, he built a ship. They sailed to the promised land in the great waters, okay, and then he was bound by his brothers. Well, there are other symbols of ancient date that are similar. First off, we find the same thing again. Orion is also Osiris. So here we see the Egyptian god referred to as Osiris on his celestial boat or barge, if you will, okay, traversing the heavens. Okay, same thing. Nephi, bound here, in this case, sailing to the land of promise in the heavens. As well as you have an ancient depiction here of a tablet showing the same thing. And unless we think this is abnormal, this similar type of story is also found in the Odyssey, where Odysseus, I believe Odysseus was tied to the mast of a ship, and the sirens, of course, keep him from falling into the grasp of the sirens. Or in this case, like in the Book of Mormon's case, Nephi, an Orion symbol, is bound to the mast of a ship, and of course, it gives us another epic. But the relationship of the stories, and the stories are actually much older than just the mythology that we have received them from, like whether it be Greek mythology or Egyptian mythology. The idea is that these stories, the way that they are written, are much more ancient, and they are referring us to teachings. In this case, Orion, the constellation Orion, holds what we call the gateway to the Temple of Heaven, specifically those stars of Orion's belt, the three stars of Orion's belt forming the entryway into the Temple of Heaven. Which is interesting that you might, when you look at the Great Pyramids of Egypt, they're laid out according to the three stars of Orion's belt. So, in a sense, perhaps more symbolic, not only are we getting a story of, people here on this continent who there was a land of Nephi, a land of Zarahemla, and those things. You may also be getting a story of people of a much older cycle who is really where we get the idea of the land of Osiris, or what we might call the land of Egypt, the Giza Plateau. So, and that there may also be symbolic patterns of, say, Zarahemla. In Zarahemla, there was 7 stars, the 7 stars of the Pleiades, the land of Zarahemla, the constellation Taurus. All these things are ancient symbols that are connected, they're written out in the Book of Mormon, made part of a linear narrative, but then hidden in such a way that those who are seeking can find them. And these aren't the only symbols. There are many other astronomical and ancient symbols meant to teach us, albeit couched in a linear story, but nevertheless they are there. You know, there's even astronomical cosmological symbolism of, the walls of the cities, of the of even Samuel the Lamanite coming down on the wall of a city. Um, Histories that are couched and accounts that are couched into the epic that we read in the Book of Mormon in its linear account, which also occurred on a much grander scale in an age prior, or should I say, much older scale than the age prior. So, in addition to seeing the Book of Mormon as just a record of just people coming from, Lehi and his family coming from Jerusalem, which is a true story, coming here and settling, they've also written the story in a way to capture a much older creation narrative, a revelation from the beginning to the end of the world. Right now, we're just discussing the beginning, which was what we have is, if you were to look at the actual pattern, the earth as a land of promise was peopled by literally three distinct peoples, probably that did not come from this world. Now you're probably thinking, that's a science fiction. Well, that may be the case, but I would ask you to consider one thing. What about Kolob? Well, in Mormonism, think about it. Is it really so far-fetched to believe that the pattern of the Book of Mormon may contain in these stories, a pen and pattern form, a much older creation account with more or additional information than just what we have in the book of Genesis? Genesis is important. It did happen. But in a sense, we're also being given details in the pattern of the Book of Mormon that expand the account, that give us a much greater understanding of a prior world that existed here before what we would consider Adam and Eve or the Garden of Eden. Okay, and perhaps even a prior one with, say, symbolized by the Jaredites. So while the Jaredites and Lehites were probably, actual people that came here to this continent, in symbol form, they also represent three distinct peoples who came to this world and follow the same pattern. Now, again, may not be actually names and places change, but the basic story of the cycle pretty much remains the same. So this is why, in some ways, the Book of Mormon is so important. We get so much tunnel vision on just the literal stories themselves, and they are important. Okay, we don't ever want to leave that Peshat or literal level, but we also want to look at the patterns of the story and what it's telling us. If we believe that the book is what it says it is, a sealed book, in other words, from a Hebrew mindset, a book that is kept from we currently don't understand it, and there is going to come a time when we will understand it, that is so hard to believe that the patterns of the story, the patterns that we see in the Book of Mormon, the symbols that we see, also contain a much greater account of the full history of this world. That it wasn't just a 7,000-year venue from Adam down to now, but that from Adam down to now, we're in one cycle. But there was another cycle or world before it. And if there was another cycle before that, there's one that goes before that. And according to some ancient teachings, and even that are maintained to this day among various traditions of the House of Israel, we represent, some say, the fifth or the sixth race, if you will, or root race on this planet. So I don't know, we don't know how many times we've gone through this. If you consider the Garden of Eden from Adam just all the way down, with each of the patriarchs' name representing a civilization, could have been hundreds of years, or is the civilization, did it go on for thousands of years? We don't know. We don't know. But what we do know is that there were prior cycles. And the Book of Mormon, if we consider it in this case, may be teaching us about a prior cycle that actually had where the earth was peopled. They had their rise and fall. Messiah came to them, okay, and they had a resurrection, and they went through their cycle until they had their ultimate demise, at which again it was relaunched with, say, like Adam and Eve, or it's relaunched again. In other words, Cycles upon cycles, patterns upon patterns. Names and places change. Story is basically the same. So that if we recognize these patterns, we begin to expand our understanding of what this earth is, where we came from, and where we are meant to go. And I leave that for your consideration. In our next presentation, we're going to have a continuation. We're going to go through some more of these symbols, more of some of the symbolism of the Book of Mormon, the names and numbers, some of the chapters that contain much more ancient information than you might think. So I would tell you that yes, the Peshat level of the Book of Mormon, the literal story, if you love that story and it's amazing, and it truly is amazing, now consider the fact that you may have a gift that has been given to you that is much greater than you ever thought. Because not only are you being given a story of the inhabitants of this continent, you may also, in symbol form, be given a much greater account of what went on before the garden, what went on in the garden, comparing it to 3 Nephi, and of course the fall after, of the garden, and what happened after. And then of course cycles repeats, and smaller cycles occur even on nations, lands, peoples. Cycles, whether large or small, we tend to repeat them. There's nothing new under the sun. So in our next one, we're going to talk about some of these following subjects. So I'm going to call it the greatest story never told. And again, I'm not asking you to accept this as fact. I want you just to consider the patterns, pray over it, think about it yourself. Because I truly believe that the Book of Mormon, including the Bible, put together, give us the greatest story that we have never been told by the Christian world, or even fully by the Jewish world. I think if we put these keys together, it begins to open up a much greater picture. So in a sense, we'll be talking about some of the coming presentations, for example, the secrets of Zarahemla and the land of Nephi. What was Zarahemla? Where is the symbolic land of Nephi? What is it meant to represent to us? Where is it on this planet? Samuel the Lamanite, the book of Genesis, and the Satan. Tohu and Vohu, 3 Nephi, desolate and laid waste. The hidden Messiah and the return to Eden. The fall of man and the end of the ancient world or cycle. So I hope you'll join us in the coming weeks as we begin to put up further presentations and begin to consider these things. Remember, don't be afraid. Never leave your foundation. Don't be afraid to explore. But at the end of the day, never leave your foundation in Christ and in God's commandments. And I want to leave that with you this time. So thank you for joining us. This is part 1 of the Hidden Revelation in the Book of Mormon, approaching the great and marvelous work. Hope you have a good day.